All right, let's jump into this deep dive. Today, we're going back in time
Back in time.
to the Great Depression.
Ooh.
You sent over some excerpts from the Wikipedia article, and
It's one of those events in history that
yeah.
casts such a long shadow.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to.
And continues to.
Yeah, it continues to inform so many of our conversations about the economy today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just like dates and textbook stuff. We're talking about real people,
Yeah.
real struggles. The article mentions the global GDP plummeting by an estimated 15% between 1929 and 1932.
It's hard to wrap your head around that number, 15%.
Yeah, the U.S. economy shrinking by 30%.
30%. It's just an incredible contraction.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom that.
Yeah.
International trade
Imagine that.
shrinking by over 50%.
Yeah, the lifeblood of the global economy just basically slowed to a trickle.
Yeah, in some countries, a third of the workforce was unemployed. That's 1 in 3 people out of a job.
Can you imagine that? Like walking down your street and
Yes.
every third house,
Yeah.
somebody's out of work. It's just incredible.
It's wild. And it wasn't just numbers on a page.
Right.
The source talks about how areas that depended on like primary sector industries like farming and mining
Right.
were hit the absolute hardest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So think about the ripple effect of that.
Yeah.
Businesses closing, families struggling to even just put food on the table.
Well, think about the cities that were dependent on heavy industry like Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was the automobile capital of the world.
Yeah.
They just came to a grinding halt. Construction projects were abandoned all over the world.
Yeah.
You'd see these skeletal structures of, half-built skyscrapers.
Wow.
And then there was the collapse in crop prices. I think they fell by 60%. Imagine being a farmer.
Yeah.
Poured your blood, sweat, and tears into your land, and suddenly the value of your crops just evaporates.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder of how interconnected everything is in an economy.
Mm-hmm.
But how did it all begin? The source mentions this sort of ongoing debate among historians about the root causes of the Depression.
Well, it's like a detective story, right? They're
Yeah.
trying to figure out who did it, what was the culprit
Mm-hmm.
that caused this massive global economic collapse.
Yeah.
And some argue that it wasn't a single event like the Wall Street crash that we always hear about,
Right.
but a culmination of
Broader trends?
broader trends, exactly.
So it wasn't just this like sudden shock.
No, it was this sort of perfect storm.
But vulnerabilities that had been building up in the system.
Right. They're looking for that underlying illness that manifested in this.
That then manifested in this
crash.
Right. So then we have the monetarists.
The monitor.
They're pointing the finger at the Federal Reserve, arguing that their failure to
manage the money supply.
maintain a stable money supply turned what maybe could have been a manageable recession into a global catastrophe.
Yeah, it's like saying that the firefighters didn't show up to put out a small fire.
Yeah.
And it ended up burning down the whole neighborhood.
Right. And the monetarists believed that the Fed could have intervened more effectively, could have prevented or at least mitigated the severity of the Depression if they had just injected more liquidity into the system.
Right, by increasing the money supply.
Yeah, okay.
They could have stemmed the bleeding, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how, like, these different interpretations can lead to very different conclusions.
And that's what makes studying history so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It's not always black and white.
Yeah.
It's about interpreting the evidence.
Yeah.
And piecing together a narrative.
Okay, and speaking of impactful decisions, the source mentions the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Oh, Smoot-Hawley.
Can you kind of paint a picture of what was happening at the time?
Okay, so picture this. The U.S. is in the throes of the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
Congress is desperate to protect American businesses and workers.
Yeah.
So they come up with this idea.
Yeah.
The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act.
Okay.
Which basically slams the door on imports by raising tariffs.
So the idea was to make foreign goods more expensive.
Yeah.
So people would buy American.
Buy American. Exactly.
Okay.
But here's the irony. It backfired.
Oh.
In a big way.
How so?
Instead of helping it,
Yeah.
actually made the Depression worse.
For the U.S.?
For the U.S. and for the entire world.
Wait, how could a policy that was meant to help the U.S. end up hurting everybody else?
Oh, because in a global economy, what one country does affects everyone else.
Yeah.
When the U.S. raised tariffs, other countries retaliated with their own tariffs.
Oh, I see.
So it created this
tit for tat.
a tit-for-tat trade war.
Yeah.
And that choked international trade, which was already struggling.
Right.
And it just
Made everything worse.
pushed the world deeper into depression. It was a classic example of,
be careful what you wish for.
yeah, unintended consequences.
The source actually mentions a survey of economic historians where 2/3 of them agreed that the Smoot-Hawley tariff act at least made the situation worse.
At the very least, some argue that it was one of the primary causes of the global depression.
It's incredible how something that seems like a domestic policy can have such far-reaching consequences.
It really shows how interconnected the
Yeah.
world was even back then.
And speaking of interconnectedness,
Yeah.
we can't overlook the role of the gold standard
The gold
in
standard.
spreading the depression.
Yeah.
Can you
I'm happy to explain that.
remind me how that worked?
Okay, so in a nutshell,
Yeah.
countries on the gold standard pegged their currencies to a fixed amount of gold. This meant that the amount of money a country could print was directly tied to its gold reserves.
So if a country loses gold,
Yeah.
it has to reduce its money supply.
Exactly. That's called deflation, which is a general decline in prices.
Right, right.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like a good thing, right? Stable prices.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't want that?
Yeah, lower prices.
But in reality, deflation can be really dangerous.
How so?
Well, when prices are falling, people tend to postpone their purchases. They think, hey, I'll just wait until it's even cheaper.
Right.
And that leads to a drop in demand, which forces businesses to lower prices even further.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy of economic decline.
Exactly. It's like a downward spiral.
Okay, so how did this gold standard actually contribute to the spread of the depression?
Okay, so when one country experienced a banking crisis or an economic shock and started losing gold, it had to implement these deflationary policies to reduce its money supply.
Okay.
But because currencies were all linked through the gold standard, those policies rippled outwards to other countries, pulling them into this deflationary vortex.
I see. So even countries that were relatively stable could get sucked into this economic black hole.
Exactly. It was like a domino effect.
Wow.
One country falls and it knocks over the next one. And the source even notes that countries that left the gold standard earlier, like the UK.
The UK and Scandinavia.
Tended to recover faster.
Much faster.
Than those that clung to it, like France and Belgium.
Right. They were stuck in that deflationary trap.
Wow. It seems like the gold standard, while it was intended to provide stability, might have actually amplified the crisis.
Yeah. It's a classic example of the road to hell being paved with good intentions.
But let's not forget that behind all these economic indicators and policy decisions are real human stories.
Absolutely.
And the source specifically mentions the experience of women during the Depression.
Right.
I think that's where we should head next.
Absolutely. Let's put a human face on this economic crisis.
Because it's easy to get lost in the economic jargon.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's the human impact that really matters.
So I'm really curious to hear about how women navigated this incredibly challenging period.
It's a story of resilience and adaptation.
Yeah.
Think about the women in rural areas.
Okay.
They had to become incredibly resourceful, expanding gardens to grow food.
Yeah.
Sewing clothes from feed sacks.
Wow.
Anything to keep their families afloat.
That's amazing.
It was truly remarkable.
Yeah.
And their role wasn't limited to the home front. Governments also recognized the importance of women's contributions during the crisis.
Yeah.
In Japan, for instance, the government encouraged housewives to reduce spending to help stabilize the economy.
So even in a time of crisis, societal expectations about women's roles still played a part.
Absolutely. And in contrast to Japan's focus on frugality, Germany, with their sights set on the future and you know, with the war on the horizon, they encouraged women to contribute to the country's economic self-sufficiency, you know, partly in preparation for the coming war.
That's really interesting. And it shows how this one single event could have such diverse impacts on women's lives.
Right, depending on where they lived.
Depending on their context.
Yeah.
But let's continue this discussion of the human impact.
Okay.
Particularly the role of World War II in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
I'm really eager to hear how a devastating war could potentially end an economic crisis.
Well, it's a fascinating and complex story.
Yeah.
We'll delve into the specifics of how wartime spending acted as this massive stimulus package that effectively pulled many countries out of the Depression.
Yeah. I can't wait to uncover those connections. This is already so insightful, and I'm looking forward to diving deeper into this crucial period in history with you.
Me too. There's so much more to uncover in part 2.
Absolutely. Okay, so we talked about the human impact of the Great Depression and some of the key events that contributed to it. But I'm curious to go a little deeper into like the economic theories behind it all. The source mentions Keynesian and monetarist viewpoints. Can you help me break those down?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are two really different schools of thought that provide different lenses through which to view the causes of the Great Depression.
Okay.
Let's start with the Keynesian view, named after John Maynard Keynes.
Okay.
A British economist who was very influential during this period.
Yeah, I've heard the name, but I'm a little fuzzy on the specifics.
Yeah, so Keynes really focused on something called aggregate demand, which is basically the total spending in an economy.
Okay.
He argued that when demand falls drastically like it did during the Depression, it creates this vicious cycle.
So like if people aren't spending, businesses don't make money.
Right.
Which leads to layoffs, and then even fewer people have money to spend.
Exactly. And then those people who are laid off don't have money to spend. So demand drops even further.
Yeah.
And it just keeps spiraling downward.
Just like this downward spiral.
Exactly. And Keynes believed that the government had a crucial role to play in breaking that cycle.
Okay.
He advocated for increased government spending, even if it meant running a budget deficit to stimulate demand and jumpstart the economy.
So it's almost like giving the economy a jumpstart with a boost of spending.
Exactly, like priming the pump.
Okay.
Now, the monetarist perspective, led by economists like Milton Friedman, takes a different approach.
Okay.
They emphasize the role of the money supply, the total amount of money circulating in an economy. They argued that the Great Depression was largely caused by the Federal Reserve's failure to maintain a stable money supply.
The source mentions something called the Great Contraction, which sounds pretty ominous.
Oh, yeah.
Was that part of the monetarist view?
It is. The Great Contraction refers to this significant reduction in the money supply during the Depression. And monetarists believe that this contraction, coupled with a series of bank failures, really amplified the crisis. They argue that if the Fed had acted more decisively to inject liquidity,
more money
exactly into the banking system, the economic fallout could have been lessened.
So almost like the Fed held on to the life raft when the ship was sinking, instead of throwing it to those who were struggling in the water.
Yeah, a very vivid analogy.
Okay.
So both the Keynesian and the monetarist views have their proponents and their critics. But what's important is that they offer distinct ways of interpreting this complex historical event.
It's like having two different sets of blueprints to understand how a building collapsed.
Exactly.
Which can then inform how you might rebuild it stronger the next time around.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of understanding how things work,
the
source also delves into some alternative explanations for the Depression.
Okay.
One that caught my eye was debt deflation, a theory developed by economist Irving Fisher.
Debt deflation. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yet it's not a good thing.
Yeah.
So imagine you take out a loan to buy a house.
Okay.
But then prices across the board start falling dramatically. Your income might drop, your investments lose value, but your loan amount stays the same.
Ouch.
That's the essence of debt deflation.
Okay.
Falling prices make the real value of debt increase, making it harder for individuals and businesses to repay their loans.
So it's not just that prices are falling.
Right.
It's the impact that has on people's ability to actually manage their debt.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more troubling.
Okay.
As debtors struggle to repay their loans, banks become more cautious about lending. Which further reduces the money supply. And fuels that deflationary spiral we talked about earlier.
So it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, vicious cycle.
Falling prices lead to more debt burden, which leads to less lending, which leads to further price drops, and so on and so forth.
It's like a domino effect that's really hard to stop once it gains momentum.
Debt deflation adds another layer to our understanding of the Depression and the various factors that contributed to its severity.
Absolutely.
It really shows how interconnected everything is in an economy.
Yes.
Prices, debt, confidence.
It's all intertwined.
Yeah. It's like a giant spider web.
Okay.
And if one strand breaks, the whole web can start to unravel.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And this idea of interconnectedness leads us to another fascinating explanation.
Okay.
Mentioned in the source.
Okay.
The expectations hypothesis.
Expectations hypothesis. Tell me more.
Yeah, so this theory suggests that people's beliefs and expectations about the future can actually have a significant impact on economic activity.
Interesting.
Think about it this way. If everyone believes the economy is going to tank, what are they going to do?
They're going to cut back on spending, probably.
Right.
Hold on to their money. Avoid making any big purchases or investments.
Exactly. Yeah. And guess what? When everyone acts that way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, because then the reduced spending leads to decreased demand,
yes,
which slows down the economy further.
Exactly, confirming those initial pessimistic beliefs.
It's almost like a collective case of the economic jitters,
right,
where fear itself becomes a driving force in the downturn.
Exactly. It highlights the power of psychology in economic events.
Okay.
You know, the Depression wasn't just about numbers and policies.
Yeah.
It was also about human behavior. Emotions, perceptions.
It's a reminder that economics isn't just this like dry, rational subject. It's about people, their decisions, and the way they react to events.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a bit.
Okay.
I'm really interested in exploring how the Great Depression played out around the world.
Yeah.
It wasn't just an American phenomenon.
Right. I'm fascinated by how this single event could have such diverse impacts on different countries and societies.
Yeah.
Where should we start our global exploration?
Let's start with a country that was particularly hard hit, Germany. You remember how we talked about American loans being crucial for Germany's recovery after World War I?
Yes, they helped rebuild their infrastructure and economy.
Right. But when the Depression hit, the tap got turned off.
Yeah.
American banks were struggling, and they cut off the flow of credit to Germany.
Right.
This was a devastating blow to the Weimar Republic, which was already facing political instability and social unrest.
Yeah, the source paints a pretty grim picture. Widespread unemployment, industrial failures, a sense of despair kind of gripping the nation.
Right.
It sounds like a perfect storm for extremist movements to take root.
And that's exactly what happened. The economic crisis created fertile ground for the rise of groups like the Nazi Party.
Wow.
Who exploited the widespread anger and frustration to gain power.
That's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder how different history might have been if the Depression hadn't happened.
Yeah.
Or at least hadn't been so severe.
It's one of those what-ifs that historians love to ponder. But for now, let's shift our focus to another part of the world, Australia.
Okay.
You might be surprised to learn that a country so far away from the United States was also deeply impacted by the Depression.
Yeah, it seems like no corner of the globe was spared.
No.
But why was Australia so vulnerable to a crisis happening on literally the other side of the world?
Well, Australia's economy at the time was heavily reliant on exports.
Okay.
Of agricultural products and raw materials, particularly to the UK.
Okay.
So when global trade collapsed during the Depression, demand for Australian goods plummeted.
The source mentions that unemployment in Australia soared to 29% in 1932.
It's a staggering number.
Almost 1 in 3 people out of work.
It was a huge blow to Australia's national identity, which prided itself on this egalitarian spirit and fair go ethos.
Right.
It led to social unrest, strikes, protests, as people struggled to make ends meet.
So there was just a lot of hardship and uncertainty everywhere you looked during this time.
Yeah, pretty much.
But did any country manage to, like, avoid the worst of the Depression?
It's interesting you ask that because the source actually mentions one country that fared relatively well.
Okay.
China.
Okay.
And the reason might surprise you, they were on a silver standard, not a gold standard.
Oh, wow. So while the gold standard was forcing all these other countries into deflation, China had more flexibility to manage its currency and its economy.
Exactly. It's a reminder that sometimes even seemingly minor differences in economic systems can have a huge impact, especially during times of crisis.
It shows that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to economics.
Yeah.
Each country's experience is shaped by its own unique set of circumstances.
Absolutely.
Speaking of unique circumstances, how did the Depression play out in Latin America?
Yeah.
They had such strong ties to the U.S. economy.
They did. And those ties ended up being a double-edged sword.
Okay.
You know, the U.S. had invested heavily in Latin America in the years leading up to the Depression. So when the U.S. economy faltered,
so did theirs.
So it's almost like a domino effect.
Yeah.
The U.S. economy topples over and knocks down others in its path.
Exactly. Latin American exports to the U.S., which had been booming, plummeted as demand dried up.
Yeah.
Governments struggled to cope with the economic fallout. Social unrest was widespread.
So it sounds like a recipe for instability.
Yeah.
But did this crisis also create any opportunities for change in Latin America?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes.
Okay.
The Depression actually forced Latin American countries to rethink their economic models and become less reliant on the U.S.
Okay.
It led to a wave of industrialization and a greater emphasis on developing their own internal markets.
So almost like it forced them to stand on their own 2 feet and forge a new path.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about economics.
Okay.
It also led to significant political shifts with the rise of new leaders and ideologies challenging the existing order. So while the Great Depression caused immense suffering, it also served as this catalyst for change and innovation in many parts of the world.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just a period of darkness and despair.
Right.
It also sparked creativity, resilience,
Yeah.
and a reimagining of possibilities. And speaking of creativity, the source touches upon the cultural impact of the Depression. I'd love to explore that a bit further.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these major historical events really shape artistic expression.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the Great Depression, with all its social and emotional turmoil, must have been a rich source of inspiration.
It was. It gave rise to some incredibly powerful literature,
Yeah.
art, and music that really captured the struggles, the anxieties, and even the glimmers of hope of that era.
The source mentions John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath.
Oh, yeah.
As a prime example.
A classic.
Such a vivid and heartbreaking portrait of the Depression's impact on ordinary people.
Yeah. It's considered a masterpiece of social realism, bringing to life the plight of migrant workers during the Dust Bowl. You know, the novel's depiction of poverty displacement and this search for a better life really resonated with people who are experiencing similar hardships.
I remember reading it in college and being so deeply moved by its portrayal of human resilience in the face of adversity.
And Steinbeck wasn't alone. The Depression inspired countless other writers, artists, and musicians to document and reflect upon their experiences.
Yeah, photography also played a huge role in capturing the realities of the Depression.
Right. Think of Dorothea Lange's iconic photograph, Migrant Mother.
Yeah.
It became a symbol of the Depression's human toll.
The source also mentions the Federal Writers Project.
Oh, yeah?
A New Deal program that employed writers to document American life during the Depression.
It was a remarkable initiative.
Yeah. It seems like the government recognized the importance of capturing these stories for posterity.
They did. The project resulted in this vast collection of oral histories, travel guides, folklore collections, and other writings that offer invaluable insights into the lives of everyday Americans during this challenging period.
It's incredible to think how a single event can inspire such a diverse range of creative responses.
Yeah.
It really shows how the human spirit can find expression even in the darkest of times.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this cultural legacy of the Depression continues to resonate with us today, reminding us of the importance of empathy, resilience, and the power of art to connect us to our shared humanity.
Okay, we've explored the economic theories, the global impact, and even the cultural legacy of the Great Depression. But there's one more intriguing aspect that the source touches on that I want to delve into. The debates surrounding its very name and its place in economic history.
Okay.
It seems like there's more to the term Great Depression than meets the eye.
There is.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how we name and categorize historical events.
Yeah.
And the term Great Depression, as we know it, has an interesting history of its own.
I'm all ears. Spill the historical tea.
Okay, so the use of the word depression to describe an economic downturn actually dates back to the 19th century.
Oh, really?
It was used by various politicians and economists, including President James Monroe, during the Panic of 1819.
So the term depression wasn't coined specifically for the 1930s crisis?
That's right. But back then, the term panic was more commonly used to describe financial crises, like the Panic of 1907.
Interesting. How language evolves and how certain terms gain prominence over time.
Right. It's like fashion. Some words come in and out of style, reflecting the changing social and cultural landscape.
Right.
But how did the term Great Depression become attached to the 1930s crisis specifically.
Yeah. How did it become like the Great Depression?
Well, initially the term Great Depression was actually used to refer to a period of economic downturn between 1873 and 1896.
Oh, wow.
Now known as the Long Depression.
Okay.
But as the 1930s crisis unfolded and its severity and global impact became more apparent, the term Great Depression was increasingly applied to this event, and eventually became the dominant designation.
So the 1930s crisis kind of stole the title from its predecessor, highlighting its scale and lasting impact.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that history is constantly being reinterpreted and reframed as new evidence emerges and perspectives evolve.
And the Great Depression, with its enduring legacy and ongoing relevance, continues to be a subject of intense scrutiny and debate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a testament to its significance as a turning point in modern history.
Yeah.
But speaking of its legacy and relevance, there's one question that looms large in my mind.
Yeah.
Could it happen again?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Right.
That's the one that economists, historians, and policymakers are constantly debating.
The source even draws some comparisons between the Great Depression and the Great Recession of 2008. Yeah.
Highlighting both similarities and differences.
Right.
And I remember the 2008 crisis feeling like a major economic earthquake.
Yeah.
A lot of people were drawing parallels to the Great Depression.
Right.
So were those comparisons justified, or were they just fear-mongering? That's a question we'll delve into in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll examine the key differences between the two crises, particularly in terms of the policy responses and the role of deflation versus inflation. We'll also explore whether the lessons learned from the Great Depression actually helped prevent a similar catastrophe in 2008.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to unraveling those connections. This has been an incredibly enlightening journey so far.
Me too.
Yeah.
And remember, our exploration doesn't have to end here. There's a wealth of information out there.
Yeah.
Books, documentaries, even more detailed Wikipedia articles if you're interested in diving even deeper into this fascinating period of history.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into the Great Depression. We've talked about the economic theories, the global impact, even the cultural legacy. But one question's still on my mind. Could it happen again? I mean, the source compares it to the 2008 crisis, which at the time felt like a major economic earthquake.
Yeah, it's a question that a lot of people have, and it's understandable why the 2008 crisis with the stock market crash and unemployment rising, and it felt like the whole global financial system was teetering on the brink. It's natural to wonder if we were heading for another Great Depression.
I remember that sense of panic, like we were about to fall into another economic abyss. So just how accurate were those comparisons? Were we really on the verge of another Great Depression?
Well, the source makes a really important distinction. While both events were major economic contractions, there were some crucial differences, especially in the way policymakers responded.
That makes sense. We've learned a lot about economics and monetary policy since the 1930s, right? So what were some of those key differences in the response?
Well, during the Great Depression, remember, the Fed was operating under the gold standard. So they were really limited in their ability to, pump money into the banking system.
Right.
And that resulted in a huge contraction of the money supply, which, as we talked about earlier, actually made the downturn even worse.
So it was almost like they had their hands tied, unable to use the tools that we have today to try to stimulate the economy.
Right. They were really constrained by the economic orthodoxy of the time.
But in 2008, the Fed took a different approach.
They did. And that's one of the main reasons why many economists believe that the 2008 recession, while severe, didn't turn into another Great Depression. They learned from the mistakes of the past and acted much more aggressively.
Okay, so what did they do differently?
Well, first they slashed interest rates to near zero.
Okay.
And then they implemented this policy called quantitative easing.
Quantitative easing. I've heard that term, but I've got to be honest, it always sounded a bit like economic jargon to me. Can you break that down in a way that even I can understand?
Sure. Think of it this way. Imagine the economy is a car engine, and it's sputtering and about to stall. Quantitative easing is like injecting fuel directly into that engine to keep it running.
Okay.
Basically, the Fed created new money and used it to buy assets like government bonds and mortgage-backed securities.
So it's like pumping money into the financial system.
Exactly, to try to get things moving again.
Okay.
And it's a really complex and sometimes controversial policy. But most economists agree that it did help prevent a complete financial meltdown in 2008.
So it seems like understanding the mistakes of the past helped policymakers act more effectively in 2008.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding these historical forces and learning from both their successes and failures.
Right, exactly.
Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.